today we're going to start our chapter on memory. And of course, because it's psychology, we're going to be focusing mainly in on human memory. But I am going to mention a couple of different non-human animal models when we're talking about how we know what we know about memory. Because not everything that we've learned from memory has come from humans. We have lots of other resources as well. So we'll talk about a couple of those as well. But like I said, we're focusing mostly on how memory works for humans. So we'll start with our usual, which is what is the topic that we're talking about? What's our definition here? So, memory refers to both the structures and the processes involved in the storage and retrieval of information. So, when we're talking about memory, we might be talking about the physical structures that are going on or that are doing things while we're forming memories. We might also be talking about the processes, what's going on at a biological level, or maybe a little bit more vague than that. As we've found with a lot of our topics, memory doesn't have a strong, precise definition that always works in all situations. So we have a little bit of, let's say, wiggle room here. So it could be physical structures, it could be processes that are happening. We might be looking at things on the cellular level, or we might be just looking at what's going on the level of, ideas that explain our storage of memory and things like that. And all of these terms and concepts are going to make a little bit more sense as we work through this chapter and we start seeing just how much we don't quite know about memory. And I suppose we shouldn't confuse the process of memory or the structures of memory with the idea of a memory, which would be referring to our recollection of a single event. So again, terminology is going to be really fun on this one, but a memory would be our specific remembering of a particular event, but memory in general is sort of the bigger picture. Okay, so on this topic, if we're thinking about memory, what can we ask? What do we want to know? So mostly we're going to focus in on the processes here. So how does information get into our memory? So how do we store things away? How is information maintained in our memory? So how do we maintain that storage? And then how is information pulled back out of memory? How do we retrieve things from our longer term storage? And so we're going to be talking about the processes of encoding, storage, and retrieval. So encoding would involve basically changing things that we're experiencing into some kind of information, some kind of code perhaps, that we could put into our memory. So if we think about say the process of transduction, which we mentioned when we were discussing sensation and perception, where we took our experiences and turned them into something that our nervous system could process so that we could perceive each of those sensations. Encoding is kind of like that for memory. How do we take our experiences and turn it into something that we can store for later? Storage is just what it sounds like. This is the process of actually maintaining that information where it's stored away for later use. And this can be stored for either a short period of time or a long period of time. And then our last process is retrieval. So how do we pull information back out of storage? How do we recover that information from our memory in order to do something with it? Maybe produce a response, especially if we're trying to monitor how people behave. Now, we're going to be talking about encoding and storage and retrieval in a lot of detail, sort of one at a time, and we're going to be doing that a little bit later on. But before we get into that, I want to take a moment, take a step back, and just talk about how we talk about memory. So what kind of terms do we use? What kinds of metaphors do we use when we're talking about memory? And that can kind of give us some idea of how we envision memory, how we consider it going on. But it'll also start highlighting some of our issues with memory because our conception of memory isn't necessarily accurate. So first, let's do a little bit of a mental exercise. So if I asked you to remember your first day of classes this year, Whether you were in person or online or some combination of both, you might have some specific memories of what you were doing. Were you with anyone? Were you anywhere in particular? What happened? So you might have some pretty strong memories where you experienced, or you can think of what you experienced on that first day of classes. And so, some of the terms that we use when we're thinking back on what happened on that first day of class, maybe we're reliving that moment as you're imagining what you were doing that day. And even asking you to remember that day, we might describe it as bringing something to the front of your mind. So, you're going in and retrieving your memory of that day, and you're bringing it back to the forefront of your mind so that you can discuss it. And this kind of sounds a little bit like our discussions of consciousness, where we had sort of our pre-conscious, our conscious, and then our unconscious. And so a lot of these information bits are stored in our pre-conscious, where we're not currently aware of them, but we can bring them to the front of our consciousness. That's kind of the same basic concept, but we're focusing in on the memory side of things, remembering things, as opposed to that conscious zooming in we did in the last chapter. But a lot of these ideas, reliving a particular moment or bringing something to the front of your mind or finding a solution or retrieving a particular memory, a lot of this fits into what we call a search metaphor. So this is where we describe the processes that are involved in memory, using terms and concepts related to the idea of searching in a physical or a virtual space. So even the idea of having encoding and storage and retrieval, that sounds an awful lot like the terms that we use when we talk about computers. We have computer storage. Maybe you have a hard drive. Encoding would be saving your files, and retrieval would be opening your files. So that kind of vocabulary is giving us this idea that we're hunting down physical things in our mental space. And if you've seen the movie Inside Out, it's a Pixar movie that deals with emotions and memories inside a child's head. They actually go looking for particular memories that are stored in physical sort of glass balls on shelves. So they are physical items that you could go and pick up and retrieve. So that would all fit with our search metaphor. And a lot of our terminology kind of revolves around this. So it started out with sort of retrieving items and objects, but of course, I also mentioned the fact that we now talk about computers and recording devices. If you're playing something back in your mind, maybe you're imagining watching an event like it's on a TV screen, something that you recorded with a video camera or something like that. So our language used to talk about memory has changed and evolved as technology has changed and evolved, which is kind of cool. So most of the concepts, most of the topics that we're going to be using really line up very well with this idea of memory as some kind of computer processing system. So that came about when computers were starting to become really popular, say the 1950s onward, and now that's kind of predominantly how people tend to conceptualize these things. But as we're going to find, these ways of framing concepts related to memory aren't necessarily accurate. So if we think about saving a file, storing it for later, and retrieving it, we kind of think of them as these individual units of unchanging information, something that we can set aside for later and resume as though nothing has changed. But as we're going to start seeing as we start working through this chapter, memory isn't necessarily as constant and unchanging as a lot of our terminology would leave us to believe. If we go back to that sort of memory activity I was saying, if you were remembering back to your first day of classes, what about if I ask you to remember back to last Wednesday or 2 Wednesdays ago? Maybe you remember a lot less detail. Maybe you don't have as clear of a mental image of what you were doing on that day, some random day in the past. So the first day of school might have stuck in your mind just a little bit better, but not necessarily a random Wednesday. So that's going to start us thinking on this idea of, okay, maybe memory isn't as precise and consistent as we might like. Another fantastic example of this is asking people to draw items that theoretically would be something that they have seen over and over again, something that you should have a very clear and accurate memory of. So if you asked a large group of people to draw a penny, as you can probably tell from the doodles on the screen here, these are American pennies. Most texts and most studies tend not to do these things for Canadian resources, but I'm sure you've seen an American penny a couple of times in your careers. All right, if we asked a large group of people, draw the heads side of a penny, what do you see? And even just looking at this small selection here, there's differences in drawing ability, which we can ignore, but we see that some people have the face facing directly towards you, some of them have them facing to the left, some facing to the right, some with other aspects around them. The words are all different. Some of them have dates, some of them don't. So there's a whole variety of information, and people aren't necessarily including the same information. And I don't know about you, but looking at this, I couldn't tell you what is the most accurate. Even if we were asking about Canadian pennies, I suppose that's not the best example because we haven't used pennies in quite some time, but maybe you were asked, what does a dime look like? You might have a vague image of a dime in your mind. You might even envision picking it up and looking at it. And maybe if you were drawing it for this example, you could, I can kind of work out what it is that I'm seeing in my mind. But how accurate would you be? And from lots and lots of studies like this, we find that there's tons of variability. And so here they've broken it down into the different elements that people have drawn on their pennies, what percent of the participants that they surveyed ended up drawing each of those elements, and whether it's accurate or not. So things that are actually on the head side of a penny and things that are not. So the heads side of a penny should have "In God We Trust," a minting date, and liberty somewhere on there. And so we can see, a lot of people got the "In God We Trust" thing. Quite a few people put a date. Not very many remembered liberty. For the things that aren't actually there, we see a lot of people who wrote 1 cent or 1 penny. A lot of people wrote United States of America, and then some Latin as well. So each of these items that aren't actually on that side of a penny appeared more often than a specific element that really is on that side of a penny. So we start seeing here that people are remembering something that did not occur more than something that does occur. So what's going on here? And so we might talk about this sort of error in our remembering as a failure of search. So if we go back to our search metaphor, we have that idea of, okay, you think about that thing. Maybe you pick it up in your mind. Maybe you remember a physical item that you can manipulate in your mental space. But this study and other studies like it show us that, okay, well, maybe what we have stored isn't accurate. So how can we store the wrong image of a penny? How does that even work? And if we think about it, even though we might not know anything about American pennies, they've been consistent. They haven't changed since 1909, so over a century. So we've probably only ever seen one kind of American penny if we've seen them. So, and if we think about the fact that they were surveying Americans who likely would have seen a lot more of them, so they should have a lot more accuracy, shouldn't they? But we end up remembering things that never necessarily occurred. So this is our first hint that our memory systems don't just record the world around us. They aren't just storing away exact replications of things that we've experienced so that we can search and retrieve them later on exactly as they were. So there must be something else going on here. So what is it? What is our memory doing, and how does it actually work? A better metaphor would be to go along with the lines of a reconstruction metaphor. So, this is the concept that we use memory to cobble together some kind of useful response using a combination of what we know and what we have available to us in a current situation. Now, that sounds very, very different from our idea of a search metaphor, where we're retrieving these fully formed memories and just reliving them. With this reconstruction metaphor, we're basically saying that our brain makes a best guess using the information that's available to it. And as we start seeing with a lot more of our memory examples, this is a lot more accurate. We tend to put things together using what we know should have happened, things that we think about, things that we sort of have stored separately from individual memories. So I guess a good example of this would be if I asked you, did your alarm wake you up this morning? Maybe it did, maybe it always does. But maybe you don't have a specific memory formed of exactly this morning's alarm waking you up. Maybe you just have that general concept of, yeah, my alarm wakes me up every single day, so my alarm must have woken me up this morning. Unless something more distinctive happened, like in my neighborhood, I have a very loud blue jay that likes to sit on one of the balconies nearby and scream really loudly. So maybe that woke me up instead. So I might have a more vivid memory of that. But if nothing exciting happened, we might just rely on our base knowledge of what happens every single day. We wouldn't necessarily be storing new information to retrieve for later. So we're going to start seeing this concept take form where we're reconstructing our best guess of what happened using a bunch of other systems. And so one of the best examples that we can use of this is to talk about something called flashbulb memories. And we're going to use them to give this idea of reconstruction, or putting together or cobbling together a memory based on what we know and some other sources as well. So a flashbulb memory is something that basically there's an event so distinctive that the events of that day sort of sear into your mind like the flash of a camera. And so the idea is that if something exciting enough or memorable enough happens, that every detail of that moment would be etched into your mind and you can remember it in vivid detail for years to come. So a lot of people propose these flashbulb memories as special, very vivid, and highly detailed memories that you can remember for very long periods of time. What we're going to find is maybe they're not that special, and maybe they're not even that different. So some of the typical flashbulb memories that you might have heard about. So if you ever hear people sit down and say, oh, what were you doing on the day of this particular event? And if it's a big event, especially something that everyone in a particular area would remember, or specifically like the whole world would remember, the idea would be that, yeah, that should be vivid enough, that should be an intense enough of a memory that you would store it forever. So we could think about JFK's assassination. So maybe your parents or grandparents remember where they were when this was reported. The Challenger explosion back in the 80s. Maybe, again, your parents remember that event, what they were doing when that happened. More recently still, September 11th. I know that at my age, I remember being in school and sort of hearing about it secondhand. But I have discovered in the last few years that new students might not have vivid memories of that date because at this point, that was 20 years ago. So what else could be a flashbulb memory? And this is kind of an aside that the texts don't necessarily talk about, but we're finding that as time goes on and as sort of we have social media and people are exposed to lots of things on the internet, there are fewer and fewer events that are so dramatic and intense that they would end up classifying as flashbulb memory forming events. So we could maybe propose things like, again, if you're American or if you have watched the American election, maybe you remember where you were when we learned that Donald Trump had been elected as president the first time round, or when Biden was elected the next time round. Maybe that mattered to you, but a little bit less universal than some of the other options. Another one that we could consider now is, I guess, where were you on the first day when things changed for COVID? So I know I was on campus. It was the last day the department was open, and one of my office mates was defending her PhD. So I have a pretty distinctive memory of that event. So maybe you do too, the last day before lockdown or something like that. So these are supposed to be distinctive moments in time that should be forming really intense, vivid memories. So let's actually take a moment and look at the accuracy or the qualities of our flashbulb memories. Now, most of the recent research on flashbulb memories has focused in on September 11th. So, looking at what people remember, where they were when it happened, who told them, all of those sorts of questions. So, we're going to look at some data from one or a couple of those different studies. Oh, lost my train of thought there. I had to stop for a moment to chase the birds off. But I think I was saying that most of the research on, or most of the recent research on flashbulb memories has been looking at September 11th. And so we're going to be pulling up some data from a couple of those studies, and we're just going to talk about what they seem to find, because it's a good representation of what we now know about flashbulb memories. So, this particular study was looking at people's recollections of what happened on September 11th, starting from 2001, so the year it happened. And then they checked in sort of a couple years later. So, survey 2, which is what's shown here for data, is 1 year later. And then survey 4 was actually 10 years later. So, I think survey 3 was at the 5-year mark. So, they've been checking in with people and asking them, what do you recall of that day? What happened? And looking at how their responses change over time. And so these bar graphs here are showing the number of participants. So this is just basically a frequency report. So how many people fall into each of these categories. And then along the bottom here, we have number of inconsistencies. So basically, between survey 1 and survey 2, how many details changed? How many things have adjusted in their recollections? So a couple of people have no differences, and almost the same amount have as many as 5 inconsistencies from the first time they were surveyed to a year later. But the interesting part is that, okay, we see this same pattern of inaccuracies. The most people have about 2 inaccuracies, but that consistency, those numbers of inaccuracies, stays pretty constant whether you're looking at 1 year later or 10 years later. And we can actually see that a little bit better here with this graph where we're looking at consistency. So proportion consistent, so basically what are they keeping the same? What is their accuracy of reporting? So a higher score on this axis would say that their first story matches their second story, which matches their third. But if we have low on this, it's saying that the first story is very different from the story they told next. And so we're looking at survey 2, which we said was 1 year later, survey 3, which was 5 years later, and survey 4, which was 10 years later. And we find they're pretty consistent in how inaccurate they are. So around 60% consistency, which means that after that first time describing what they remember, about 40% of their details have changed. And their confidence in their reporting. So if they were asked, how sure are you of the details that you remember? People seem to be pretty consistently confident, even though they tend to be very inaccurate in recalling exactly what was going on. And we see this pattern across multiple types of flashbulb memories, whether we're looking at, say, JFK's assassination or the verdict of the O.J. Simpson trial, which have all been extensively studied for this. So what we find is that flashbulb memories tend to be inaccurate, but they're also consistently inaccurate, so they don't deteriorate in time. They just, they're like normal memories. People have fairly fairly high confidence in how accurate their memories are, even though they tend not to be very accurate. And if we start looking, and as we'll see later on in the chapter, this is consistent for normal memories, where things that we remember tend to be reconstructed. So we think we know what happened, we fill in the gaps with sort of logic and base knowledge, and we tend to get something that's kind of all right, but not necessarily perfectly accurate, and that's fine. So, our big conclusion here before we move on is that flashbulb memories tend to be inconsistent, but so do normal memories. And this tells us that flashbulb memories aren't necessarily special kinds of memories. They're really just normal memories that we think are more accurate, but in fact are not. All right, and so this brings us to this idea that, yes, memory is then reconstructive. So we reconstruct our memories based on available information. So we would, maybe we don't remember exactly how we got from A to B today, but we know that we typically take a particular path or do a particular set of behaviors, so that must be what happened. We assume and fill in some of the gaps in our memory using logic or whatever else we have available to us. So the available information is really important. And we can actually look at some of the research where if you bias people's sort of available information, you can change their recall, which is, as we'll talk about again, why something like, say, eyewitness accounts in testimony for, say, trials isn't necessarily the most reliable course of action. But for the most part, memory serves its function. The process can lead us to pretty much correct recall. It gets us the information that we need, and it's accurate enough to function. But we do have some of those issues. Sometimes we fill in the gaps incorrectly. As we saw with our draw a penny, you would see this if you were asked to draw a globe. And as we talked about just now with our flashbulb memories. So we need to keep in mind that it isn't necessarily going to be perfect, correct recall every single time, depending on the scenario.